And what's really interesting about who we think of as authorities are generally these people tend to fall into two main categories in regards to experts in American Buddhism. One of them is like the Asian expert. And by Asian, I mean like from Asia and not residing in the United States and not an American citizen. And then the other category are sort of European or white Americans seen as experts. And what I really am trying to call attention to in this presentation today and in some of my larger work around race and American Buddhism is the lack of attention paid to Asian American Buddhists, Asian Americans who come from families that have practiced Buddhism, and also Asian American Buddhists who have converted later on to Buddhism. And one of the reasons why that is so interesting and why it creates a phenomenon that's worth looking at is because in actuality, when you look at who Asian or who American Buddhists are, the overall population, around 69% it was stated in the 2012 Pew Report on American Religions, around 69% are actually Asian or Asian American Buddhists. And in that context, when I say Asian and Asian American, I'm referring to descendants from Asia who are residing in the United States, and sometimes they politically see themselves as more Asian than Asian American. But my focus here is on those of us who reside in the United States, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. To the topic of today's talk or presentation, and really it's a little bit more informal because I do want to have a conversation since I feel like this is a rare opportunity to talk about this issue. The title is Recentering Asian and Asian Americans in American Buddhism. And again, my name is Funie Hsu. I am a professor of American Studies at San Jose State University. And my PhD actually is in education. I used to be an elementary school teacher. So I'm really interested in this idea of knowledge in general and who gets to make knowledge and who gets to be seen as an expert, which is a theme that's going to run across today's talk. And if you look at the photograph on my title slide, I intentionally selected this group of what's called the Junior YBA Buddhist practitioners, which is a young Buddhist association that comes from the Jodo Shinshu tradition, because I'm really moved by this young generation of Asian American Buddhists and the fact that there is a growing retention problem across many Asian American Buddhist traditions. And I think a lot of that has been shaped by race and more specifically, white superiority and this takeover of American Buddhism, framing it around a white practice. Okay, so a little bit more about who I am. Well, I was born in Taiwan and I was raised in the United States. So I consider myself a Taiwanese American. And I grew up in a Buddhist household. So I grew up going to temples and surrounded by the cultural aspects of Buddhism as well as the religious practices and the philosophy. So on the left, you see an image of Shilai Temple, which I believe it's the largest Buddhist monastery in North America. I think that's, if I'm recalling correctly, it still holds that title. And I really like this image because it has these little kids playing around, and that's kind of how I grew up. And mostly going there growing up. But I also practiced in different Taiwanese Chan Buddhist traditions as well, not just through the Shilai Institute or institution. I'm also, if you see on the bottom right-hand corner image, board member of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. And then on the left-hand corner, you see this monastic who is a woman. And that's really important to me because in my context of Buddhism that I practice, women have been an overwhelming majority of our practice, and women have been an overwhelming majority of who I've seen as leaders and authorities in the development of my education and my knowledge construction around American Buddhism. And I share all of this for two reasons. One of them is to kind of let you know who I am, so establish more of a relationship. And the second reason is a political purpose, to point out that it's very rare to have someone like me give a presentation in regards to any aspect of American Buddhism. By someone like me, I mean someone who was raised Buddhist and who is Asian American. these are the type of voices we do not hear. And that's the point that I'm going to be making throughout this presentation. And relatedly, I'm going to be ending with some suggestions on how we can counter this and recenter this majority population in American Buddhism. So to get at the core of what I'm trying to point out today, some of the main ideas, I am demonstrating that this popular conception of American Buddhism, and I put that in quotes because this is not exactly how I would find American Buddhism, but this is how it's popularly understood. It suffers from a great delusion, to put it in Buddhist terms. And in other words, I argue that American Buddhism has a really big race problem. And specifically, this race problem, I mean, there are many facets of it, because American Buddhism is situated in a broader American society that has these long-standing struggles with race and continues to have these struggles with race. And we see that very apparently with this current political administration, presidential administration. But within Buddhism, specifically in the United States, there's also this problem of race that revolves around Asian Americans that doesn't get discussed, or rarely gets discussed. And so I argue that it excludes the majority of Asian Buddhists or American Buddhist practitioners, that is Asian and Asian Americans, from this narrative, from the story of American Buddhism. And again, one piece of evidence we can cite to demonstrate that Asian and Asian American Buddhists, again, Asian meaning, in this context, Asians who are living in the United States, is the Pew Report Forum, or Pew Forum Report on American Religions that was released in 2012. Now, there are many issues with this Pew Report, but one thing that is helpful is that it does demonstrate that Asian and Asian American Buddhists make up the majority of Buddhist practitioners in the US. So it really helps us illuminate that there's this glaring problem, this grand delusion in American Buddhism, that we don't recognize the majority of the practitioners. And I really am trying to demonstrate, and I argue that American Buddhism is a history of Asian immigration and the cultivation of Asian American Buddhist practices in the context of exclusion. And I mean this in legal terms, and I'll look a little bit at some of the immigration history, and white supremacy as well. So really, I'm trying to reframe and recenter and argue that we all should be doing this as American Buddhists. The history of American Buddhism, the stories we tell of it, our understanding of it. So it does come from a history of Asian immigration and a history of Asian immigrant Buddhists who practice Buddhism in spite of and in the face of white racism. Asian and Asian American are two distinct concepts. Asian most often refers to people from Asia and residing in Asia. And in the way that I'm talking about Asian as a group with Asian American in this presentation today, and overall in the body of work that I write about in regards to Buddhism, are people from Asia or descendants of Asian immigrants, but who are currently residing in the US, along with Asian Americans. And so there's a political distinction there between Asians residing in the US and Asian Americans. But to make it very clear, I'm talking about the space of the United States. I'm not talking about like the Dalai Lama, because that would be someone who's an Asian Buddhist practitioner, but not in the US context. I'm really concerned with mostly what's happening in America and American Buddhism. Okay, so to move in with the historical context and a little bit about Asian immigration, I'll begin with kind of defining this term that I really find useful. It's called racialization, and it's from some research by Omi and Wynant. And pretty much the definition is as you see it there. It's from their overall theory of something called racial formation. And racialization they describe as the concept that signifies the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. So it's a way of understanding how something that previously didn't have any kind of racial understanding attached to it then becomes understood within this idea of race, or this dynamic of race that we have, especially in the United States. And so I'm showing that for Asian American Buddhists, being Asian and being Buddhist, both of those things are important parts of our racialization. So it's not just that we were excluded because legally we were excluded in American history because we were Asian, but it's also because we were Buddhist. And that's the side that doesn't get talked about as much. Okay, so Buddhism is part of racialization. One of the things I really like to do in my work is to use these political cartoons because they demonstrate a part of American history that's kind of very difficult to evoke just using words or legal documents, but it also demonstrates the sentiment, the public sentiment at that time period. And so what we have here, an illustration that is from the mid 1800s, around that era, that shows the extreme anti-Chinese animosity that was festering, especially in the West Coast during the time period. So the first wave of immigrants from Asia can also be understood as the first wave of Buddhist practitioners in the United States, or the first big wave of Buddhist practitioners that actually formed a community. Now, there were some European Americans at the time period, some white Americans, in the early 1900s that started to develop an interest in Buddhism, but these weren't Buddhist communities. These were small numbers of individuals, and the first Buddhist communities that were established in the United States really were these Asian immigrant communities, like the Chinese that came over. The first Chinese came over in response to the discovery of gold in 1848 at Sutter's Mill in California. So in 1850, there was an estimated 4,000 Chinese in the West Coast and predominantly in California. By 1865, there were 50,000. And with the development of the railroads across the continent and the need for laborers, cheap laborers that could be exploited, Chinese became sought after as a labor source for the railroads. Immediately following the end of the railroad work, then Chinese started to be seen as a drain on the labor system, as a threat to the ability of white workers to obtain work on the West Coast, a threat to the white miners in regards to being able to find gold and make fortunes off of gold. So we have this rapid extension and establishment of anti-Chinese sentiment. But the point I'm trying to make here is not just that it was anti-Chinese sentiment, but that, again, these were the first Buddhist populations in the United States. So the racialization, the fact that this hatred was aimed at Chinese, was also wrapped up with this hatred of Buddhism, because these Chinese were seen as heathens. And so there's this religious connotation even in this idea of who the Chinese were. The heathen Chinese, it was said at the time period, along with this idea of the yellow peril, these yellow Asiatic hordes coming from Asia to invade the United States. And one of the ways that we saw this racial and religious threat was in this description and the laws that were implemented, city ordinances in the West Coast around the religious practices of the Chinese. And so I should also say that the Chinese were a combination of Buddhist and Taoist and local religions. And a lot of times Buddhist practice was kind of an accumulation of all these other practices all at once. And so an example of the sort of discriminatory ways of perceiving the Chinese and racializing them at this time period is evidenced with this quote that I thought was really fascinating. It's from 1855, and it's a description of a celebration of Independence Day in San Francisco by some local Chinese in the area. So this person is saying that their gongs, their cymbals, their wooden bowls or drums, and strange stringed instruments, probably what's called an erhu, made the air hideous with diabolical sounds. So there's this idea that's established early on that these practices that the Chinese are engaging in, these religious practices, are so foreign, they're so un-American, that they are damaging to kind of the purity of what is seen as American. And part of that purity is this kind of religious sanctity of American Protestantism. So therefore, the Chinese practices are diabolical. And it wasn't just that these sounds were diabolical, it was the religion in general. The city of San Francisco would go on to pass on ordinances to forbid ceremonial gongs and the use of them, effectively prohibiting Chinese Americans at that time period from engaging in a lot of the important religious and ceremonial acts that they found important. And then of course, there is this culmination of exclusion legally through the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was the very first time in American history that you have a racial group identified and isolated for exclusion. And I found this recently, this political cartoon I thought was really fascinating. It's from Harper's Weekly in 1870, July 23rd. And it really demonstrates that this story that we tell of immigrants being a threat and a drain to American society and a need to exclude them and push them outside of the United States is an old tale. And it also included the discrimination that was aimed at Asian Americans during that time. So with exclusion of the Chinese Americans, what happened was that the Japanese American population that was starting to grow on the West Coast was similarly then targeted for exclusion, and not necessarily immigration exclusion at the time period, but we'll see other forms of exclusion. I'm going to skip this slide, but very briefly, this is a quote from a professor of agricultural studies at UC Berkeley in 1920, pretty much saying that the Anglo-Saxons and the Japanese could not live together side by side in the US. And this professor then goes on to advocate for what's called the Alien Land Law, and to restrict land purchases from Japanese or by Japanese Americans. So we see this growth of anti-Chinese sentiment, then transition into anti-Japanese sentiment. These photographs have been making the rounds a little bit more lately because of all this talk around the Muslim registry, and these very strong similar parallels with what happened with the Japanese Americans during World War II, and the sorts of hate and hysteria that's being generated around Muslims in America today. And of course, Japanese Americans then were targeted for mass incarceration during World War II, and the work of Duncan Ryukin Williams at USC is really doing some, I think, groundbreaking analysis of the way that it wasn't just Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, but the fact that these Japanese Americans, a majority of them were Buddhists. And he's really demonstrating that racialization for Asian American Buddhists, that it's not just that we were excluded because of our race, we were excluded also because we were Buddhists. And being Buddhist was part of how we were racialized. And here we see a congregation of Buddhists in the Jodo Shinshu tradition in Bakersfield in 1925. So again, this is really demonstrating the fact that the earliest American Buddhist communities in the US were Asian Americans. And this is a history we don't see. This is a history we don't understand when we think about American Buddhism in the wider mainstream conversation. But despite incarceration, despite this racialization practice, American Buddhism was able to flourish in the US in the face of white oppression, as I mentioned earlier in my argument. So Buddhist work, Buddhist organizations, Buddhist practice persisted through these time periods. And incarceration is just one example. It's one of the largest kind of structural illustrations of American oppression and racism. And it's useful because of that to show how Buddhists, even during overt instances of racism and white supremacy, maintained our practice. And then to the right here, we have a photograph of a Butsudan, an altar that was constructed. I believe this was constructed completely of found materials in the concentration camps, because as you may know, that most Japanese American families, when they went to, when they relocated, they had to forego most of their household items and take only what they could carry or sell everything. Oppression and repression of Asian American Buddhists in the United States in this history is not to say that we've kind of like slowly died away, because very much it's still a vital community. And as I mentioned, And to demonstrate in this article that I wrote in Buddha Dharma magazine, we've been here all along and we continue to be here. And that's why I found using this image of the junior YBA state convention from Hawaii really, really important to show that there continues to be future generations of Asian American Buddhist practitioners. Though a lot of the issues around race and white supremacy is creating effects, measurable effects to the retention of these communities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this white superiority, and this is something that can be discussed for days. We really don't have enough time to talk about the specifics of it, so this is a very quick and general overview that I'm going to be discussing, and I hope we can talk more about it in the Q&A. But I'd like to share this image from Angry Asian Buddhists, and it captures this project that I believe was done in 2012, maybe it was ongoing, I don't recall the specifics, but it was called the Shambhala Sun Under 35 Project, and it was trying to celebrate these Buddhist practitioners and meditators in America and highlight some of the cases of who these people are, kind of profile them. And what Angry Asian Buddhists, of course, pointed out was, mere glance, you could tell that most of these practitioners that are given space and they're given kind of attention are white Americans. And what we don't see are the majority of American Buddhists in the United States. We don't see the Asian and Asian American Buddhist practitioners. So there's a really big delusion that's occurring in this Buddhist practice, which is kind of the irony that we're not seeing these ways we practice in this kind of racial delusion. And my point in highlighting this is not really a politics of inclusion. I am interested in diversity, but I'm also very cautious of this idea of inclusion for diversity's sake, because often what happens in that kind of idea of diversity is it's a tokenized version of diversity. We simply call upon one or two people of color just to say we have diversity. What I'm more interested in is a critical challenge to this conquest, this imposition of white knowledge and white expertise in American Buddhism. And to state something that I really don't think it's that radical at all, because it's just historical fact. But to say this often triggers a lot of anger. And it's simply to say Buddhism is an indigenous Asian tradition. That's a historical fact. But for someone like me, who's an Asian American Buddhist, raised Buddhist in the United States, for me to assert this fact calls and creates a lot of anger on the part of certain types of American Buddhists. And it points to this fact that mainstream American Buddhism is aggressively hostile towards these historical realities. And it illuminates some glaring concerns about the very foundations of what gets called mainstream American Buddhism. Another way of discussing why I think this issue is so important is because, again, it's not necessary that it's an issue of inclusion and diversity in that regards, but it's an issue, in my point of view, of something bigger and something deeper that is termed epistemology, or in regards to this idea known as epistemology. So what is epistemology? It can be explained as the study or a theory of the nature and grounds of knowledge, especially with reference to its limits and validity. So one way that people talk about epistemology is using this quote: how you know that you know what you know, how you know that you know what you know, or how you know something to be true. So at the core then of American Buddhism is this fundamental epistemological concern that asks, like, how do we know that something is actually true, or someone's Buddhist practice is actually true or right? And who gets to know, and who gets to decide if something is true or right? In other words, who gets to be seen as the experts? Which leads us back to that question earlier on in the reflection: who are the authorities in American Buddhism? I'm really situating this discussion around work that's been done in regards to race and religion, and specifically American Buddhism by Joseph Chea, where he states specifically, explicitly, that American Buddhism is centered in this broader history of colonialism and white supremacy. And he goes on to talk about how colonialism in Asia by European Americans shaped what we understand as Buddhism, and then how that shaped what we understand as Buddhism in American Buddhism, and how that placed white practitioners at the very top as the experts that got to determine what was authentic Buddhism and what was labeled as false Buddhism, or this cultural Buddhism. This cultural Buddhism then, that was practiced by Asian Americans and Asians, was seen as kind of like illegitimate, degenerate forms of Buddhism. And it was very much tied to the ways, if you look at the photograph on the right, that Asian Americans were racialized. And this is a photograph of a Japanese American or Japanese man. I don't remember if he was Japanese American, probably judging by his age, he was Japanese, being arrested by the FBI for questioning right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And Duncan Williams writes about this history and points out that I think it's like not even within 24 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the first people to be arrested and targeted by the FBI were Japanese American Buddhists. White practitioners being able to decide what gets labeled as authentic Buddhism and what gets labeled as this kind of superstitious Buddhism that's practiced by Asians and Asian Americans. So here we're talking about the chanting, kind of like the maintaining of family altars, reciting, like these practices that are so embedded in culture that they don't even get a label as a practice. These things are kind of construed as superstitious, as fake Buddhism, inauthentic, and not just that, but they denigrate the purity of Buddhism. At least that's how it's constructed by certain white Buddhist scholars and certain white Buddhist practitioners, and has been done so historically in how we understand American Buddhism, and it continues to be done even today. Here I have an excerpt from some writing that's talking specifically about this sense of white superiority in American Buddhism, and it comes from a piece called Buddhists of Asian, or a larger issue, special issue on Asian Buddhists of Asian descent in the U.S., published by the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. And the writers here are saying, not long ago, a prominent European American Buddhist related that during a trip to Japan, she discovered that she knew more about Zen than most Japanese. This innocent remark reflects some all too common perceptions often held by non-Asian Buddhists, that they are more knowledgeable about Buddhism, that they practice real Buddhism as opposed to what's often called folk Buddhism. And you can substitute folk for cultural Buddhism, or superstitious Buddhism, or inauthentic Buddhism. So the racial dynamic is really, really clear here. There's also a parallel to what happens in the history of colonialism of other people of color. And I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that the history of Asian American Buddhists is the same as the histories of those people who had to deal with settler colonialism, because it's very different. Asian Americans in the United States are participating in settler colonialism. So it's different in that regards, but the way that Buddhism has been wrapped up in European colonialism shares a similar power dynamic that I think is really evidenced in this quote from the Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith. And she says, "It appalls us that the West can desire, extract, and claim ownership of our ways of knowing, our imagery, the things we create and produce, and then simultaneously reject the people who created and developed those ideas and seek to deny them further opportunities to be creators of their own culture and own nations." So what she says here is, in a very shocking way, something that can be applied to describe what's happening with American Buddhism in the US, that the people, that is Asians and descendants of Asian immigrants, who maintained and were the cultures in which Buddhism came from, different kinds of Buddhisms came from, are being denied their authority on their indigenous practices. and they're being denied the further opportunities to be creators of their own cultures. So what are some of the effects? Well, in addition to this inaccurate historical representation of American Buddhism and this lack of rigor in understanding the complexity of the different American Buddhist communities, there's a continued racial domination that's happening in American Buddhism. So especially for everyone here that's listening, it seems that there's an interest that you might all share in racial justice and this connection between how we can use Buddhism to advance racial justice. Well, one of the things that I'm arguing and pointing out is that for us to do that, we also have to understand how embedded within American Buddhism, there has been this long-standing racial struggle. So in order for us to think about Buddhism and racial justice, we also must counter or deal with the racism that's embedded within what we understand American Buddhism to be, the mainstream understanding of it, which is the erasure of Asian American Buddhist communities and practices. Some of the other effects are this continued white ownership and authority over an indigenous Asian practice and appropriation. In my article in Buddha Dharma, I talk about how when cultural appropriation is discussed in American Buddhism, which is not that often, it often focuses on these external artifacts like the beads, Buddha statues, etc. But I see the fact that Asian American Buddhists are left out of this consideration in the conversation of American Buddhism in itself as cultural appropriation. And another really, really important effect that I'm concerned with is the fact that Asian American Buddhists may then feel a strong sense of distance and shame from their cultural and family practices, and they might learn to disassociate from what is seen as the baggage Buddhism, this superstitious quote-unquote Buddhism that their family practices and feel that that's not the right kind of Buddhism. I myself, for many years when I was growing up, didn't identify publicly as Buddhist because of these very reasons, because I was taught that, well, first of all, that I was going to hell because I was Buddhist. I was told that many times by different types of Christians, even Asian American Christians, and also because I didn't feel like I was practicing the type of Buddhism that I thought was the legitimate kind because of what I saw in popular magazines and media. And this is not something that's just an individual isolated case that I face. I thought it was really interesting in the work of Tenzin Han, who was coming out with a book on interviews that she did with young Asian American Buddhists, and who also had this article called "We're Not Who You Think We Are" in Buddha Dharma. I think it was fall 2016. It's available online, so if you Google it, you can find it. She writes about this very feeling of kind of like feeling shamed about Asian American Buddhist practices. And she says, "It saddens me that many Asian Americans, myself included, are reluctant to come out as Buddhists. Sometimes this reluctance arises from a fear of being discriminated against or stereotyped. Sometimes it comes from a sense of inadequacy and inauthenticity when comparing ourselves to the white Buddhists who seem to be doing most of the defining in American Buddhism. Yet I'm also reassured by a reminder from Melissa, an interviewee whose Buddhist journey has taken her from a college meditation group on the East Coast to a Buddhist nunnery in China, to various sanghas in her native Bay Area. Even if they aren't a trending topic on social media, Asian American Buddhists are everywhere. We are everywhere, and we have been everywhere. But again, the fact of this internalized racism in the heart mind can develop for practitioners of American Buddhism, both who are white practitioners and also people of color. Ideas. What can we do about this dilemma, this delusion? How can we recenter Asian American Buddhists and American Buddhism? Well, I have some suggestions. First of all, we can practice non-duality in understandings of American racism. Again, we seem to, everyone on this call, have a shared interest in racial justice. And I think it will help us to transcend this idea of race in the United States, which for so long has been framed as this issue of black and white. There's a struggle between African Americans and white Americans in the US, which is a really important issue to talk about. But race in America also goes beyond that. And especially within Buddhism, race in America includes the exclusion of Asian and Asian Americans. We can read works about and by Asian and Asian American Buddhists, invite Asian and Asian American Buddhists and scholars as speakers to your Sangha. Integrate Asian and Asian American Buddhists who practice directly in Asian traditions as authorities in their Sanghas, to know them as knowledge holders or to see them as experts and authorities, instead of relying on the same people that we hear about all the time who are experts. And again, because the fact that these same people usually fall within the category of Asian outside of the United States or white Americans. Reorganize organizational leadership to include Asian and Asian American Buddhists. Solicit Asian and Asian American Buddhist perspectives in popular publications and give them compensation or dana to recognize their labor and not further exploit them by taking from them and not recognizing the labor that's put into their work and sharing their perspectives. And create activities of gratitude for and remembrance of Asian and Asian American Buddhist ancestors. So these are just some ideas to get us started. And of course, there are opportunities to practice this recentering that far exceed what I have on this list here. And I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts are on recentering and race and the exclusion of Asian and Asian American Buddhists. We need Asian American Buddhists who don't fit the mold. And I think actually that's what I'm trying to get at, more than the fact that we just need Asian American Buddhist perspectives. More importantly, we need Asian American Buddhists that don't fit the mold, that are willing to go beyond these myths that have been imposed upon us by the system of white dominance, the myth that's told to us that we are the model minority, which therefore creates this division between us and other people of color. So many of us buy into that. So many of us Asian Americans do buy into that. And therefore, we need Asian American Buddhists that don't fit the mold, that are willing to say things in our Sanghas. And I see those people as across the different racial groups, quote unquote racial groups, and to be able to build solidarity across people like that who are willing to challenge things that we see in society and in our Buddhist communities. Just some closing thoughts. I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that I think Asian and Asian American Buddhist traditions are the most authentic, nor do I think they're unproblematic, because I definitely do think that they are. I myself come from this history of struggling with which particular tradition I want to identify with. And I also recognize that within Asian and Asian American Buddhist traditions, there are a lot of people who are breaking the mold in Asia and in the United States. So it's not to say that they're completely problematic either. I mean, I think it's like with any other tradition. You can always find these global dynamics of power, like shaping Buddhist traditions in all the Sanghas that there are. That being said, I feel like one of the most beautiful possibilities of American Buddhism is that the fact that it comes from this history of non-white peoples kind of contending with race in America and contending with these very overt forms of exclusion. Duncan Williams, I mentioned I talked to him yesterday, and he really makes so clear how Japanese American Buddhists who are incarcerated, for them, Buddhism was constructed as a terrorist threat in the same, well, maybe not the same way, but in parallel ways to what we're seeing with the Muslim American community. So it's kind of, it almost defies the mind in this mainstream conception of American Buddhism to think about at one time in American history, Buddhism was seen as a threat to American national security. But to really keep that in mind, that that's the history of American Buddhism for all practitioners, whether we're Asian American, white, African American, Latino, Latinx, whatever, that's our history. But because we have that history in explicitly struggling through racism, using our practice, that can be where we continue to evolve. And this link of racial justice can be the way that American Buddhism distinguishes itself in the way that Buddhism, as it's traveled throughout Asia, has distinguished itself in the different locales and geographies. I find a lot of potential for liberation in the possibility of recognizing this history and struggling through race at the beginnings of American Buddhism and taking it further by being very clear that that's what we're trying to do. And that's what we have done in the past. And I think that's the area for solidarity with other American Buddhists who are dealing with issues of race. And we see that so predominantly and prominently in American media and in the ongoing different types of violences that are occurring on a day-to-day basis. I just remember being so touched to hear the significance of Buddhism to her practice as an African-American woman in the United States, and feeling like it is such a beautiful gift, this Dharma, for liberation of all beings, and that we need to share it. And Asian American communities have to have conversations with how we can be more inclusive in the way that we share, and the racism that can happen in our sanghas as well. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. One of the things I was also thinking about, and just kind of like really feeling gratitude for everyone that's listening to the call, is that the teaching that the people we encounter in this life, we've encountered them before. So I just wonder, like, what are the things that brought you here, and what are the things that might have brought us together in a past life, and really appreciating the totality of us being able to share space again right now. Thank you so much.
And may the merit of this call extend to all those along the spectrum and to the future liberation of all.